Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a quick clarification for the Deputy Prime Minister. I acknowledge and thank him for stating very clearly that government will provide more information in response to some of the interventions that the various MPs have made. And I think this is important because it's trying to link it to the final subject matter that the Deputy Prime Minister covered about usage of reserves and so forth or suggestions that were made by the opposition. I think these were in a particular context. Didn't come up in this debate, but certainly in previous debates where we talked about how we can make up for funding gaps vis-a-vis GST and all that. So the call for information actually is very much part of how the opposition tries to understand or tries to work through a mechanism or a framework of fiscal prudence as well. And I'll give you an example how we do that. Minister talked about, Finance Minister, I beg your pardon, talked about unemployment insurance, and I think he made clear at his roundup speech that it'll be financed through taxes. And the Workers' Party had proposed a scheme which was actually financed by employer and employee. And so I would be cautious to suggest that the opposition essentially just wants to dig into the reserve, because we do think about the financial prudence question quite carefully. The second point, that was just a clarification for the Finance Minister. The second point is with regard to growth. I think there were members in the House in the course of the debate who talked about growth. Indeed, growth is important, but I think the key point here is sustainable growth. And I think this is the real key going forward in this decade, because we have seen what happened 1 decade ago, about 10 years ago, the sort of debates we were having in this House, and DPM was there. Government, basically ministers came out to say we are slowing down growth. We have to, because the situation had changed so dramatically. And so going forward, I think the real question is not so much what I think one member I heard saying that I make no apologies for growth. I think we have to be careful if we go down that road. But I think we have to frame a conversation on sustainable growth. And then I think there'll be support for many policies that the government proposes.
Mr. Speaker, on the second point, I fully agree with Mr. Pritam Singh that we are all about sustainable growth. There were instances in the past where perhaps infrastructure was not ready, for example, and that's why we have put in place processes, updated our planning processes, made sure that we plan our infrastructure well. And that's why, as I highlighted just now, I went through some pains to explain where the increase in foreign workers were coming from. The large part of it are work permit holders, especially in construction. And there's a good reason for this. We are ramping up our building program for public housing. We are undertaking major infrastructure projects. We need these workers to build our infrastructure and homes. By and large, these workers certainly do not compete with Singaporeans for jobs. And the issue there really is about planning for infrastructure. And that's why I said just now that we are making sure that we get the dormitories ready, making sure that we build more, making sure that we build better recreational centers for them so that they are housed well and we can take care of their well-being. So yes, we want sustainable growth and we will pursue sustainable growth. On Mr. Singh's earlier points, I thank him for his clarification, but perhaps he could also clarify, because the Workers' Party had previously objected to GST and eventually now accepted the GST at 7%, but the debate we had earlier was about the 2 percentage points increase in GST, and the options, the alternatives that the Workers' Party advocated were use the reserves, increase the NIR, do these instead of GST. Now that we have implemented GST, as the Workers' Party said with the 7%, now that it's done, we've accepted it. Perhaps Mr. Singh might clarify, you too, perhaps the Workers' Party would accept the 9% as a reality, and would you then also say that the proposals to use more of the reserves by the NIRC, a higher share of NIRC, are therefore no longer relevant, and the Workers' Party is fully consistent with the PAP where it comes to our framework and rules for the use of the reserves?
Mr. Speaker, I would say that when we make proposals, it is in the context of what is before us at that point in time. I think that is what I would have to respond with. Now, earlier on in this debate, we had a bit of a back and forth. I think member Mr. Murali Pillai and my colleague Mr. Jamus Lim engaged in an exchange about the information that we have to put together policies, budgets, to understand whether whatever we do going forward is going to be sustainable. I put the question to Mr. Murali Pillai about how this, not about how, but what the $40 billion that has been committed by the Minister of Finance is going to go towards. Now, we have no insight on those sort of matters. So I cannot make any promise here that we are reneging or stepping back on a commitment to look for expenditures, look for revenues to fund some of these policy objectives, because we don't have an insight into those things. Now, by and large, I think the vision or whatever is before the Workers' Party in particular. I can't speak for the entire opposition, but we'll have to work with the information that we have. We are not in government. And if it means that we have to look at all options, we will look at all options.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned just now, MOF will certainly continue to provide more information where it's necessary, where we are able to. We have been putting out more information already, and we will continue to do so. And if there are specific information that members would like, we will be happy to review. And if there is no security or difficulties, we will certainly want to put them out. That's our commitment. But the basic point I was getting at is whether or not there was a difference. There is a difference in our fundamental fiscal philosophy. And I think that's important, because there was a time when there was alignment in this House between the PAP and the Workers' Party. There was a time under Mr. Lau Tia Kiang where it was very clear the ethos of fiscal responsibility was the same across both sides of the House. It seemed to me that this had changed under Mr. Pritam Singh, that the position had changed under Mr. Pritam Singh. And the Workers' Party, of course, is free to change its position, but I think it should be clear if this is so. As far as the PAP is concerned, our position is quite clear. Doesn't mean that policies cannot change. Of course, we review, circumstances change, we update our policies. But where it comes to certain fundamental principles and values, like fiscal responsibility, a basic orientation, not just to look at today, but for the future, this must never be compromised. This must never change. These principles were put in place by our founding leaders. They have continued under successive leaders of the PAP, and they will certainly continue under my watch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I've heard this. I've heard this before in this House. The point again I would make in response to that is, indeed, I have to agree with the Finance Minister. Policies change. A PAP government yesterday would return the money that it has used from the reserves as a matter of principle. But today, a PAP government may not return the money it uses from the reserves. That's my response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just two areas of clarification for DPM. I think the first is on the CPF. Does he believe that it's adequate to plan for retirement adequacy via risk-free returns instead of taking reasonable risks via a diversified, well-managed portfolio for the long term? So in other words, if our investment entities are good enough for our collective reserves, why is it not good enough for individual Singaporeans' retirement reserves? The second is in relation to the RRIS, which I mentioned during my speech as well. Again, now that DPM is now DPM and soon to be PM, does he intend to still follow through on the government's acceptance of the recommendation in 2016 on the RRIS? If so, when, and if not, why not? Thank you.
Sir, the returns may be risk-free from the CPF members' perspective, but they are certainly not risk-free rates at all. I mean, if you want risk-free rates, then they will be much lower. The reason why we are able to provide such higher rates compared to market risk-free rates is because there is government support behind the CPF system, and we are providing additional interest up to 6% for those with lower balances. We are designing a system that will ensure that all Singaporeans who work consistently, contribute to their CPF, will be able to have their basic retirement needs met. That's our objective. Now, going beyond that, can we improve it? As I say, we will continue to study. There are complexities in this, and includes the LRIS that was highlighted. It's not so straightforward, because once you introduce a new element of risk in the hope of getting better returns, you have the issue of what happens when retirees retire, when seniors retire in a bad year. Then how do you smoothen that out? Once you smoothen that out, Mr. Louis Chua is from finance, insurance doesn't come free. Who pays for the insurance? It has to come through the returns. Then are you able to provide a better product than what is the current CPF rates? Those are the considerations, and we continue to study. We are not saying never, but we will continue to work on making the system better.
So I have some clarifications for the DPM. Regarding the job seekers' support, I understand that it is going to be funded by taxpayers, and it's not an insurance scheme like what the Workers' Party has been proposing since 2006. So I'm a bit concerned now about the fiscal impact and the sustainability of the scheme. What is the quantum then, and the duration what's the quantum that's going to be given to the job seekers, and what is the duration of support that's going to be provided? Because Parliament, I believe Parliament needs to know, because we are being asked to approve the budget for this year. Thank you.
DPM Wong.
Sir, the scheme is not being rolled out this year. It doesn't impact FY24 budget. We will provide details of the scheme, including the detailed fiscal impact, and at that time there will be a full debate on the parameters and the fiscal requirements and whether it's sustainable.
In an MAS macroeconomic review paper published in October 2022, a breakdown of the sources of inflation here attributed between a third to as much as 3/5 to domestic drivers, depending on the sector. Now, what might some of these domestic drivers be? I would contend that the decision to hike GST would likely have contributed to domestic inflation. Now, to be clear, the data used in the MAS study predates the GST hikes, but we have plenty of examples globally that VAT hikes do indeed spark inflation. So my first question to DPM Wong is if he still believes that the timing of raising GST was justified, or if at least a postponement, given, especially given how the country has had bumper tax receipts from other sources in recent years, may instead have been wise. Now, as an aside, I would state that the WP categorically objects to the insinuation that we are less fiscally responsible, not least because, while it's true that DPM Wong it's his prerogative to think that the alternative levers of revenue that the Workers' Party has suggested are untenable, but it's not true that we do not think about fiscal balances. Now, my second question has to do with what DPM Wong said about keeping Singapore competitive in the face of BEPS. Unlike what he said, I have no illusions, in fact, about the practicality. Indeed, the design of BEPS took into account the practicality of a race to the bottom, and grants countries the right to apply a countervailing top-up tax if they believe that countries haven't played by the rules, or at least the spirit. So, my fully non-theoretical question that I have for DPM Wong is, what will the government do if other countries choose to apply this tax top-up in response to a belief that our RIC contravenes the spirit of the refundable tax credit scheme?
So on the GST, does it impact on inflation? Yes, it does impact on prices, but the impact is once-off. It's not permanent. We've made that point clear. MAS has made that point clear. And if you look at the overall impact on inflation, actually, it has been less than what we had. I mean, it's not been. We have seen the impact on that monthly inflation when GST went up. But if you look at the subsequent trends down the rest of the month, inflation continues to moderate, as it has in other advanced economies. You can look at the situation last year, and we are quite clear that it's very likely to continue this year as well. So the impact of GST is not the key driver behind our inflation spike. I've explained what the key drivers were. and neither will it cause us to have inflation remaining high, because that disinflation trend that's happening globally, we are seeing similar trends in Singapore, and our inflation rates are also coming down. So that's on the first point. And to be very clear, even with the GST in place, we have deferred the impact of GST on the lower income groups with the assurance package by more than 5 years for the vast majority of Singaporeans. And it's not even a temporary relief, because for the low-income groups, we have enhanced the permanent GST vouchers so that GST does not hurt the poor in Singapore. We have gone through these debates extensively, and I think we are in a good position to explain why the GST was needed and why, in fact, the additional revenues are needed, because we can already see the rising expenditure trends very rapidly. It will happen in the next few years. If we had not done it at the time we did, when will be a good time to do it? And well, if we were to do it this year or next year, will the opposition therefore support it? I seriously doubt so. So I think our approach is, let's do it correctly, let's do it in good time, put in place, make sure that our fiscal system remains sound, and always ensure that we have sufficient revenues to cover our spending. That's what we have done. On BEPS, the RIC is compliant with BEPS. This is something that was discussed as part of the BEPS conversations. These sorts of refundable tax credits are allowed under BEPS rules. That's why we are doing it. And that's why we need to understand the realities of the world. Governments all are doing it.